Once you've mastered a game, a good way to keep it interesting is to create self-imposed restrictions to make a new playthrough much more difficult, testing both the limits of your own skill and what's possible within the game. We've been doing this in LittleBigPlanet for years, whether it was by not letting Sackboy use his grab, not collecting any bubbles, or playing without moving left. But what if the restriction was instead put onto the player's abilities, not Sackboy's? What if we took away the most fundamental thing that we have? The thing that gives us nearly all of our information for playing the game: vision. This type of challenge, known as Blindfolded, is common across many communities and is easily one of the hardest ways to play any game. What makes LittleBigPlanet difficult in particular is its physics-based deterministic nature, where the smallest difference in a set of starting conditions can produce wildly different outcomes later on. I'm sure anyone who's played this game can tell you how brutal some of these story levels can be when even the smallest thing goes wrong. So it's easy to imagine how levels like the construction site and the bunker would go without being able to see anything. But it is something that we are going to do with the use of some pretty crazy strategies. Although this is a challenge that I took upon myself to complete, none of this would exist without Night Carries, an incredibly skilled player and speedrunner who was the first and only to attempt any kind of blindfolded run for multiple years, coming up with a significant number of the solutions that allowed every level to be completed. And also MX, another important player from the speedrunning community, whose random attempt of a level was the actual thing that pushed me to try the challenge in the first place. So we'll be going through each story level individually while explaining all of the difficulties, problems, and strategies that it took to beat them, while also showing the actual attempt of when they were beaten by me from the many live streams that were spent completing the challenge, where in place of a face cam, my avatar's eyes in the bottom right were used to indicate whether I could see or not. Which I know really isn't great for authenticity, so it's up to you with how much you trust me. Also, this is not a speedrun challenge. We don't care about being fast. Beating each level is the only thing that matters here. But we did use a timer to keep track of how long it took to beat each level across all attempts, letting us get a good idea of each one's difficulty. Introduction is one of the easiest levels to finish, considering that there aren't really any ways to die in it, letting us pretty much just run to the right, and letting our memory of the level's layout tell us roughly when to jump. There are a number of ledges, but it doesn't even matter if you get stuck because just jumping and moving will get you to the end eventually, probably in only a couple of minutes. Progression through the level is even signaled by the sound of checkpoints, other sound effects, and even the voice of Stephen Fry.
Press the left stick.
And it's also a good thing that there's an option to turn off the music, because it just makes everything a lot easier. First Steps actually requires us to start thinking about what we're doing, where even though there still isn't really anything that can kill us, these ramps need jumps to be made at certain times. But this is where we get to start grabbing objects, which is one of the most useful sounds that Sackboy can make, where by listening for when he's able to grab and not grab an object, we're able to learn a lot about his state and position. So after hearing Humpty Dumpty talk to us and getting past the first platform, we can keep track of our position on the mushrooms by repeatedly tapping R1 until we've heard Sackboy go past both sponges, where we can then jump the gap. This is the second one, I think. Okay, and now I think I should just be able to run and jump. Yes, we made it. Okay. A similar thing can then be done for the next mushrooms, but because of how simple these jumps are, using muscle memory also works well enough. Collecting bubbles is also one of the most useful sounds in the game for determining Sackboy's position, where at this layer changing section you can use them to know once you've made it onto a platform. Oh. Is that the middle layer? But also, because the checkpoint is so close, it's pretty easy to just slide up the wall next to it to skip dealing with the front layer entirely. And as well as that, because I got stuck from the lower ramp not being glued down, I actually used a death abuse here to reset my position, which is another really useful tool. From here, it's pretty easy to just drop down and make it to the water wheel, again using the score bubbles to tell you when you're in the right spot. The water wheel itself is pretty lenient too, where after the haltery tri-pit, the next interesting part is at the sticker sensors. Because of how the game highlights the correct stickers though, and all of the sounds that the sensors make, it's actually pretty easy to place everything correctly, even while standing directly in front of one. Am I like standing in front of it or something? Okay, great. The scoreboard is pretty much straight after this, letting first steps be completed rather easily. In Get a Grip, the sounds of physics starts to be useful, where after holding R1 and running right, we eventually start pushing the sponge block, which makes a sliding and then collision sound, telling us that it's now against the wall for us to jump over. For the next obstacle, we can align ourselves to the left wall, then do the same thing to get the white block over, then again for the green block after moving back to the left, where we then hear the closed level post go off. Then the triangle block is interesting because it needs to be knocked over, but a good strategy is to get on its left, then jump and grab to pull it down. You can even check its orientation by trying to jump and grab it again, where if it has fallen over you won't hear a grab. After climbing over, it's easy to get the horse down the hill, where then because the ends of them are grabbable, you can manage to find both horses to make it past both ledges. For the next section, pushing the green block all the way against the wall works well, where it's pretty straightforward to then climb up. These horses even play a sound effect when grabbed. Here, okay. It can be a little annoying with how the platforms on them are round, but again, the score bubbles are a great indicator of your position. Oh, that was a good noise. Then instead of dealing with the hole and getting the next horse past it, I just ended up walking down on my own, until getting a jump that happened to activate the checkpoint to then hold to retry. The timing to grab the sponges in this area is super lenient, so it's not that hard to make it to the castle after just finding the first one, which you can do just by jumping and grabbing until you hear it. No. Okay. The seesaws though are a bit more interesting. A good way to work out their position is to get on one side using a wall, then jump and grab while in front of it. With this, you'll either just land on the seesaw if it's already down, or end up pulling it down if it was up, to then jump on it, where it's easy enough to climb up. The volume of the water sound effects can also be used to know where you are throughout this area, with how the camera moves between each part. Once on the third level of the castle, you can just jump and grab until you hear the sponge, letting you swing out of this section. Then from here, all the level is making it to the last horse, putting his tail on and riding to the scoreboard, which is all pretty easy. Now, Skate to Victory is the first real challenging level, with it being the first to introduce moving hazards and just more complex platforming. It's actually surprisingly difficult for only the fourth level. After grabbing the bird, the windmills are easy enough to get past with all of the checkpoints here, and being able to just jump and grab to reach them, where you don't even need to touch the third one. The water wheel still isn't a problem if you take your time, and the next checkpoint is in a nice spot to know when to let go of the bird. But this is where we reach the jetpack, which is actually kind of annoying to get because of the overhang on the platform. Then once we do get it, all of our stick movement suddenly becomes twice as hard to do with the added dimension, which is made even worse with how we're meant to pick up and move objects around. Thankfully though, we can skip a majority of that, and there's even a setup to make it easy that uses the sound of the jetpack. So after equipping it, if we move down and right, the jetpack starts making noise, where we eventually make it into this corner next to a sponge, where the jetpack then becomes much quieter due to us no longer moving. Once in this position, we can fly directly up to grab the sponge that's already in the basket through the cardboard, letting us then pull it down to open the door, moving us on to the hardest part of the level, the castle. The boot is actually pretty easy to get past with the slam sound effects that it plays. But the ghosts are what makes this level so hard because of their moving gas. And like outside the castle, we're supposed to do some back and forth movement to get the sponge block and climb up, which we'd like to avoid if we can since it's hard to tell where the ghosts are all of the time. So before the boot, we can get into the back layer, then run right while it's lowered to get into this corner, letting us jump onto the boot from a consistent position. This is another place where the physics sounds are useful, because after jumping onto the boot and getting launched by it, Sackboy makes a quiet but distinct noise when he hits the roof, then the boot again. Which, if we listen out for, lets us easily time 2 consecutive jumps to make it onto the first platform near the ghosts, completely skipping the sponge block. Now this is where we really need to listen carefully to work out where the ghosts are. It would probably be easy to find them with how they play a sound effects when you get near them, but for some reason this doesn't work for the first ghost. So instead we have to use the next best thing, the winches. Winches play a sound effect when moving, which is actually distinct based on whether it's retracting or extending. If a winch is extending, it plays a sound that gradually decreases in pitch. If a winch is retracting, it plays a sound that gradually increases in pitch. And so, because the movement of the 3 ghost winches are actually synced with each other, we can just listen for the leftmost one using the stereo audio, and wait for a specific moment during its cycle to start moving. What am I doing? I have to go when it stops moving up, I think. So I found that by running after it has finished retracting, you can make it all the way up to the button without stopping, where the score bubbles are again incredibly useful in knowing where you are on the platforms. Then after pressing the button, running off after a moment should get you into the next room, but I messed it up. So a backup that I found was to wait on the floor by the first ghost, to then start running after a moment of it extending, getting us to the checkpoint in one movement, where we then get forced to interact with another sponge block. It's not as useful listening to the ghost's winch in this room because of how it's also attached to a piston, which we can't hear. But something I found is after getting past the ghost while pushing the sponge block against the wall, which does take a bit of luck, if you align yourself to the other side of that wall, you're completely safe, and the ghost will only get close enough to you to make a noise during one specific moment during its entire cycle, giving us a way to know exactly where it is. Also, if you didn't know, if you hold R1 while running into a wall, it will force Sackboy to not change layer, even if he normally would, which is extremely useful for aligning ourselves to certain walls like this one. This is also where I started using the sound of the wobble bolts on the ghost's arms as a timer, which we'll use to keep track of its position further. So once we're against this wall and we hear the ghost make its noise, we count 3 wobble bolt movements, pull out the sponge, and make it to the first platform. Then after the 9th arm movement, we can jump up to the left, then up to the button, completely avoiding the ghost. Just drag it out and jump off of it. 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9... Finally. It's not over yet though, because after activating the boot, we count another 3 arm movements from the ghost to know when to run off, then 5 more after that to know when to jump off the boot, completing that room. Finally. 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, I think. Okay. God, that took so long. Once up here, a good way to find the next platform is to move into the back layer and slowly move over to the right, spamming the jump button in between movements and listening to its sound effect. Eventually, Sackboy will be able to jump very rapidly, meaning he's underneath the platform, letting you then change forward and easily climb up until reaching the checkpoint. Then unfortunately, this next part never really got a good strategy because of how inconsistent the ghost movement is. So there is some luck involved here, but it's not too bad. We run right to press the button, then immediately run left, where we start spamming the jump button shortly after while Sackboy is in the air. This lets us jump straight onto the boot when we land, where all that's left is to run to the right, jump, and hope that the ghost isn't in the way. If it isn't, we can make it to the checkpoint, which thankfully is exactly what happened in my run. There wasn't any need for a backup. Ah, dude, I jumped too early. Oh, we did it! We did it! Oh my god! Thankfully, the rest of the castle isn't nearly as bad. The next ghost is also a bit hard to keep track of and requires a bit of luck, but it's not too hard to listen for when the pistons finish a movement to try jumping, and then jumping again straight after, where if another jump does happen, it means you must have landed on the platform and you can climb the rest of the way, where if another jump didn't happen, it means you must have not landed on the platform at all. From here, it's easy to find the next sponge and listen to the boot's squeak sound effect, and for when the sponge collides with the boot to know when to let go, to then pull down the next sponge and climb up to the race gate. The skateboard is optional, but it's easy to use. Then after more of these overhanging platforms, it's not really hard to make it to the scoreboard, but you can check if you're on the platform or not by listening for if a drop down is possible, with how it plays a much deeper version of the jump sound. Okay, but with that, we're now finished with the gardens, which really wasn't that bad. It's just that Skate to Victory can be pretty brutal for such an early level, where even though the timer only says 3 hours and 36 minutes, I actually kept accidentally resetting it while doing attempts, so it really took closer to 5 hours and 40 minutes to do, which I do think is mostly just because I wasn't totally used to being blindfolded yet. The start of Swinging Safari can be funny because it's normally very easy to escape the submarine, but if it happens to flip over, you may as well restart the level. The winches on the giraffes can't really be told apart because they're always moving in opposite directions, but we found that if you stand and wait in a certain spot, you'll eventually collect a score bubble that's on the first giraffe, so you can use that to know when to go up. Then it's easy enough to use the winches to make it the rest of the way, and same for the third one since you can actually hear what direction it's moving in now. The grab timing for the monkey tails is pretty lenient, it's just annoying if you happen to grab in a bad spot, but we can easily make it to the next giraffes. After letting go of the second one, you can use this corner to find the third. Then these monkeys are a bit more strict on their grab timing, but it's still not that hard. It's once we reach these jumping ones where we have to be a bit more careful. This section actually becomes much better though once you realize that each monkey jumps one after another in a perfect sequence, which makes it super easy to listen for each winch. This is also the first fire hazard in the game, which actually makes this even easier with how we can just use a fire boost to get past instead of jumping, letting us make it up to Zola. The buffalo section might be the most difficult part in this level with how they're kind of a moving platform, but if we make it all the way to the right, we can actually hear when each buffalo's motorbolt gets emitted. So the strategy was to wait until one is about to spawn, where there'll be a gap, to move to the back layer, then jump shortly after a new buffalo spawns to make it to the monkey. Then for the last obstacle, as long as you're careful with your spacing before jumping, it's pretty easy to swing over to the scoreboard, completing the level. The many platforms at the beginning of Burning Forest can be a bit hard to get past, but it's actually great that it's right at the start because it means that you can just keep restarting until you get lucky enough. You can even use the closed level post to time the first jump, and all of the score bubbles help too. It's then easy enough to make it up to the buffalo, which is one of the main struggles for this level with their weird up and down movements and having to time jumps off of them at specific moments. Except, unlike in Skate to Victory, there isn't really a consistent sound here that we can count to time things. So this is where we'll be using a completely new mechanic to help us instead, the level music. Even though Sackboy doesn't have any control over the music in a level once it starts playing, we can actually still manipulate it by using the pause menu's audio settings, where if you turn the music back on after it's been turned off, the music is forced to restart from its beginning. With this, we can simply open the menu and restart the music whenever we want, giving us the song as a sort of timer. So in Burning Forest, we wait for one of the buffalo to play its sound effects, meaning it's usually safe to jump, where we then start the music mid-air, land on the buffalo, and start listening. For this section, I found that jumping slightly before the third didgeridoo sound plays gets us to the next checkpoint. Great, I'm here again now. We then turn the music off so it isn't distracting, but you could do a similar thing for the next buffalo ride. The window for jumping off is so large though that it's not that hard to guess the timing, with the score bubbles telling you when you're on the bridge. After the monkey, it's another situation where we can actually hear the motorbolt on the buffalo being emitted, which lets us know when one is in a good position. Then for jumping off, instead of using the music again, the sound of the big croc is actually a perfect indicator, letting us grab the sponge to pretty easily swing up. Even though there are quite a lot of sponges here, the timing for letting go and re-grabbing is very generous, just like every other obstacle like this. My strategy to get through the next section was to move into this corner while in the back layer to avoid the enemy, then jump and run down to the right, to drop down in between these crocs. From here, we can very slowly move to the left until we're able to collect the score bubbles below. These sponges actually are a bit scary, but the idea is to try and make it down to the lowest one, swing to safety, and then use the back layer to reach the checkpoint. Then unfortunately, the next sponges aren't much better and admittedly require a bit of luck, because there isn't really any way to know where the enemies are before going down, but hopefully you can manage to get around them to activate the checkpoint. They do have very large weak spots and are only in certain layers, but that's only really useful if you take note of which ones, unlike me. What do I do here? Jumping's probably a good bet. Then after another good guess of when to jump and swing across the sponges, we can now finish this one, which was nicely challenging. The Meerkat Kingdom would probably be another challenging one if there weren't two different ways to skip the entire thing. I imagine these bouncy meerkats being the most annoying. But yeah, since our only goal is to finish each level with or without skips, it's super easy to just stand in the back layer, deload the entrance like usual, fall down to the end and finish the level in only 44 seconds. But just for fun, we also finished the level without the deload too. Still while using a skip though. So to do that, we can easily get down to the race gate, then use the sound of it turning on to get into the right spot to move out of bounds. After this we run to the right for a while, get lucky with a few of the bouncy meerkats, until making it out and running to the scoreboard in only 3 minutes. The big skeleton in the wedding reception does require a jump, but it's not hard to time. What is a bit hard to time though, are the jumps off these springy platforms. Except surprisingly, the sounds of the springs stretching helps a lot with knowing when to jump. Letting us get up to the ledge. The next platform is fine, especially with the prize bubble, then the sections up to this skull are mostly just walking. Even the skull here isn't that hard to get bounced up by once you're next to it, and same for this one, making it to the elevators. Thankfully the pistons make a lot of noise here, especially when standing in front of the first one, making it easy to find, where it's then pretty straightforward getting up the rest. This next part is a bit challenging with jumping between the skeletons, but the score bubbles help a ton with knowing exactly where you are on each platform. You don't even need to jump for the first few, letting us now reach the hardest section of the level by far, the 6 springy platforms. There are 2 main problems with these. The first is that it can be really hard to tell where you are on each platform, and the second is that it can be incredibly difficult trying to gain height from a standstill, as the springs make very little noise until you get a decent amount of height. This took me a pretty long time to figure out, but because the bottom right score bubble on each platform can be collected without jumping, you can use that to work out where you are. So we get down to the 3rd platform with some normal jumps, where we then bounce up to the 4th. Which can take a while since, for some reason, these springs in particular barely make any noise. But once we know we've made it, we can slowly move to the right until collecting the score bubble, where we then again start jumping, with the sounds of the springs letting us know once we've gotten enough height to get to the next platform. Which is then done 2 more times to finish the section after over 2 hours of trying. Then thankfully the final area is a lot easier, where we can find the skull just by getting close enough to then jump and hold right to hopefully make it straight up to the last platform. Being able to skip the second skull makes this a lot easier, but there is still a bit of luck with getting enough height off the first one. It's not too bad though, letting us finish this one. The dog in the darkness is super annoying because there isn't really any way to know which direction it's moving in until activating a checkpoint or something. We can at least get onto it easily though, letting us get up to the ramp without doing much, to then pull it down. But this is where I never really found a good strategy to get back onto the dog, where I almost game over trying to do so, until just winging it and guessing where the next spikes were. The score bubbles help a lot with the next few platforms, and getting the dog up the elevator is pretty easy, where it then gets captured. I tried to do a strategy by skipping the next set of elevators by riding on the collector, but I got unlucky. Thankfully though, like in the previous level, once you get onto them, the rest are easy to climb up. Now this is where the level starts to become a bit harder, but we can use the back layer with the candles here to completely avoid all of the spikes until reaching the bats. We can hear the piston movement here, but unlike winches and wobble bolts, the direction they're moving in is much harder to identify. They do make a different sound for each direction, but it's so subtle. This made the obstacle kind of a 50-50 chance to get through, which isn't great. But that's when we noticed that the block further to the right always makes a collision sound when it retracts. And it's perfectly in sync with the bat cycles, meaning we can use it to work out exactly where everything is. It makes the noise when the first bat finishes moving down, so we can use that and the sound of the pistons to run through when both bats aren't in the way. Yes, we did it. That same sound can then be used to get past the block that's making the noise, where we then continue to use it to know where the next bat is too, since it's also in sync like the other ones. The back layer is also useful here to get as close to the bat as possible without dying. Then since the next goal is above the platform, you can just jump and grab until finding it, where we then use the candle strategy again, and then one more time after this, until making it up to Don Lu. And then swinging across these skulls really is the worst, because even though we can hear their positions pretty well from the winches, as soon as you mess up after grabbing one, it never goes back to moving consistently with how much it's able to swing around. So this ended up killing me a few times, to the point where I had to go back to the previous checkpoint to get more lives, where thankfully I got lucky enough to finally grab the skull again to make it all the way across. The next part with Don Lu and the button is pretty free from hazards, so it's easy enough to take your time until getting him up, where we then reach some more elevators that are just like the previous ones. Not a problem. Then the ramps by the Skulldozer are easy enough to climb up too with how open the area is, letting us complete one of the longest levels in the game, surprisingly quickly.
Ah, yes, we did it.
I feel like for these challenges, Skulldozer is only ever a big problem, or not a problem at all, and in this case, it's the latter. If you really wanted, you could probably try to memorize all of the places where you need to jump, but as it turns out, even if you just hold right the entire time and repeatedly die, you actually still end up finishing the level with a single life left. So this level is really about as hard as Introduction was, if not easier. The only thing is that if you happen to get slightly unlucky, you might die one extra time, but it's not like it's a long level. On to the canyons. These first few jumps in Boomtown are pretty easy, especially with the prize bubbles. Then as long as the blocks get knocked down how you're expecting, getting over these cacti is fine. For most of my attempts though, they didn't do what I wanted. But I found that pushing and then pulling them worked pretty well. Doing the speedrunning trick of climbing up the mountain here is actually pretty easy and much faster than going up normally, but after pushing the next button I accidentally died, which ended up forcing me to go up the whole thing anyway. Then the town section is fine, and using the rocket car isn't a problem either. It's once reaching the Scorpions where we have to prepare for something pretty difficult. Like Skate to Victory, Boomtown is one of the few levels that contains a jetpack, which we know only makes all of our movement much harder to do. And it's made even worse by the fact that we're meant to be carrying impact explosives around moving obstacles, making for possibly one of the hardest sections in the entire game to do blindfolded. So that's why we're opting to do the skip for the level instead, where we swing onto the collector using a scorpion, and then jump off him at the right time to get out of bounds, which is still really hard to do, but definitely better than the jetpack. Since all of this requires pretty precise timing, we're going to be using the music again to time our movements, where after about 30 minutes of practice and only on the second attempt, this is the strategy that ended up working. The Scorpion's winches are super loud, so it's easy to know when they're not in the way, letting us reach the third one along. From here, we wait until this Scorpion is right about to move up, then pause the game and turn the music on. But we're not going to resume the game yet, with how the start of the song is kind of quiet, so as soon as the guitars join in, we unpause and start running. With this, when the bass plays these two distinct notes, it's our signal to turn back around, where with our muscle memory, we grab the Scorpion, swing upwards and land on the collector, where once we're in this corner, we wait for the accordion to play these two high notes, telling us that it's time to run to the right and jump.
Did I actually make it? What?
Where all that we have to do to finish the level is run along the rocks in the back layer, dropping us off at the scoreboard. And now for the longest level in the game, the mines, whose worst section happens to be at the very end by the way, but we'll deal with that once we get to it. The closed level post is a pretty good signal to jump for the beginning, then after barely surviving, it's pretty easy to get to the first minecart. This one's nice because you don't need to listen for where it is, since if you go down to the prize bubble, you can just hold R1 where it will eventually pick you up. There isn't much of a strategy for the next set of enemies, but jumping and just hoping usually works. The next minecart is fine too, then instead of dealing with these baskets, it's a lot easier to use the lever to position yourself exactly, to then time a jump across the pit. On the elevator, the enemies above actually start making noise at the perfect time to jump off. Trying to kill them can be a bit annoying though. Again, the brain hitboxes are pretty big, but it can be pretty easy just to die over and over, which isn't really that big of a deal since it doesn't take that long to get to this point. The launcher is fine because you can't die on it, and then after getting to the next minecart, we can do the same thing as before with waiting in front of it while holding grab. These elevators are kind of similar to the Buffalo in Burning Forest, where we have to wait for a specific moment to jump off, so that's why we're going to be using the music again. The strategy is to stand in front of the checkpoint, turn on the music, then only start running once the first vocal sound effects plays. Most of the time, this will get you onto the first elevator, where we then wait until about a second after the next vocal sound effect is played to start running left onto the next elevator. After this, we wait until the next bar of the guitar is played to move to the next one. Then to finish, we run off at some point during the guitar's next bar. The timing is pretty lenient, so this works most of the time. The middle layer avoids the enemy, then as long as you take your time with the timed explosives, it's not too bad. You can even hear them hit the floor after being spawned. It can just be a bit annoying getting past the cardboard if it happens to get into an awkward position. But again, there's not much danger here, so you can just keep trying stuff until you make it to the checkpoint. Then once you are here, it's easy to jump the gap after running for a moment, where then grabbing the trigger explosive can be used to find your position for the next jump. Up the ramp, I found it was easiest to do the next jump by finding the trigger explosive again, running to the right, then jumping after about a second, letting us make it over to the next minecart, except we can't get onto this one as easily as the others. It's not too bad though, because also like the buffalo, we can hear when the motorbolt gets emitted, letting us time a drop down. Unfortunately, we do have to kill this enemy, which is annoying because there isn't really any way to tell which side the hammer is on, so sometimes you die, but doing that does tell you where the hammer is, so it's not all bad. But now we're up to another pretty significant obstacle. For these wheels, there isn't really any place that you can stand still, which usually makes things hard, but we can just keep holding on to most of them until we're ready, which is almost as good. We only grab the first one for a moment before moving to the second. Then a great way to know when to let go is to keep trying to jump until it lets us. Using this, we can let go of the second wheel at the right time to get to the third. Then after collecting the score bubbles, we can skip one of the wheels just by falling down and fire boosting, where then once we're able to jump, we can let go of this wheel to do one last movement to the ledge. These minecarts are less straightforward again to get onto with how they don't really start making any noise until getting speed, with how they only use bolts for their wheels. But because the spawn timing is consistent, we found that after moving left a bit, a good time to drop down is when the previous minecart starts to roll down the hill, which is when the bolts become audible. But then we have the switch, which can be a bit tricky, but the sound of the enemy as you go past it can be used to time a jump shortly after, where the sponge is only grabbed for a second or so. Then to get out of this minecart, you can just wait until the sound of it crashing to jump. Awesome. Then we've got more wheels, but thankfully we can skip most of them by falling down to the right off the first one, then moving left after falling to reach the last grabbable wheel. Then to time this part, you can wait until Sackboy collects the key, to then fall down and jump to the right. I just failed it a few times and had to guess the timing, but it can work. Once you land here, you can go straight to the back layer to be safe from the enemies, where you can then move to the right and start jumping until you manage to kill the first two, since you'll only change layer once it's safe. Then to kill the last enemy, we're going to be using another brand new audio mechanic, because without it, there really isn't any way to know where it is, with the new mechanic being how the camera affects sound. Obviously, the further away the source of a sound is, the quieter it will be to us, but sources that are off-screen actually become muffled as well. This isn't that useful normally, but by opening the costumes menu, we can force the camera to greatly zoom in to give us a much tighter frame, where an audio source now needs to be a lot closer to Sackboy for it to sound clear. So for this enemy, we align ourselves to the wall, which is just outside of its range, zoom in, then wait until the sound of the enemy's legs and pistons becomes literally loud and clear, to finally kill it. Okay, bringing us to the final and hardest section of the level, the fireball chase. This section is so difficult because of the number of hazards that we need to jump over, especially near the end with how dense it all is, and how we have very little room for slowing down to take things carefully. But thankfully, we do have a double ring checkpoint, and it is fire, letting us touch it once before dying. So using that, we can actually walk off the first ledge safely, then use the next fire boost to time the first actual jump. We then jump off the next ledge, which is easy, and use another fire boost to time the next jump, where then another fire boost gets us down to the bottom level, the hard part. There's a total of 8 pieces of fire to jump over here, and with how close together they all are, fire boosting isn't really an option. So all I can really say for what the best strategy might be is to just try and do light, evenly spaced jumps until making it through, as there really isn't much else that you can do here. It's just very easy for something to go wrong, especially with this game's physics. But you do at least have some time to try and get your bearings if something unexpected happens. But anyway, on my successful attempt of this level, I only ended up dying once here, which was very relieving.
Oh my god. Oh, finally! We're out of here!
Where the scoreboard is found straight after to finish this one. The main obstacles in Serpentine are very loud, making them pretty easy to work with. It's just the spike enemies that are still kind of annoying. We pretty much just guess for the first one. Then for each serpent, we can find the edge using the score bubbles, to then jump when we hear it go past. The strategy that I wanted to do for this next part was to land on the snake's platform to then jump across and bounce off the enemy, but instead the snake blocked me, so we just ended up using the other bouncy platform, which works. Then since there aren't any score bubbles for the next serpent, a good way to find the edge is to fire boost off of it as it goes past. This lets us make it to the next checkpoint, to then kill the snake enemy by guessing where it is. The bouncy platforms are easy enough, then we can actually listen for where the next snake enemy is with how it goes off screen. Then there's this section with the 3 different levels. We can do the same strategy as before, with listening to the serpents to get through the top level, except for the enemy, where we just run straight down to the second level once the serpent goes past to avoid the spikes. Then like in speedruns, we're actually going to skip most of the second and third level just by falling down at the right time here, which surprisingly isn't that hard thanks to this really nice strategy that I learnt off of Night Carries. At the checkpoint, we zoom in to hear more precisely where the serpent is, where as soon as it goes past, we run off to the left, to then hold right shortly after.
Oh, we made it.
Where the generous size of the checkpoint's range gives us a pretty good chance of activating it, even if we die afterwards. After this, we keep moving across the platforms like normal, where we then need to get a bit lucky with killing these enemies, as their positions relative to each other is always changing. Thankfully, this wasn't an issue in my attempt, letting us make it to the last serpent, which really isn't hard to avoid for the first run since you don't even need the sponges. The second run is a bit more tight though, where instead of going for the sponge, I found that a good strategy was just to move to the back layer as the serpent comes down, which then makes the timing for going across the gap quite easy too. And now for the boss fight. The first phase is actually quite straightforward. I tried to avoid the impact explosives by running left after the third one was thrown, which didn't work the first time, but even if you die you can still get the timed explosive over to the wall, getting us to the second phase pretty easily, which is where it starts to become a bit hard. The timing of the different bombs and the movement of the platforms are all synced, so you can kind of use the sound of the explosions to know where everything is. Where my strategy was to immediately move the time bomb into the middle after it was thrown, wait, and then move it the rest of the way. This worked, but I did get pretty lucky since I didn't handle the bomb very well. I then got stuck underneath the platforms for a while, which is fine because you're pretty safe down there. Then the same strategy worked for the second timed explosive, ending the fight. I got stuck again afterwards, but after being squished, I was able to move across the platforms and make it to the scoreboard, thus finishing the canyons. Lowrider gives us a nice break with how easy it is. Driving the car is incredibly simple to do, and bouncing up the cars isn't really a challenge either with how few hazards are in the area. Then we have another easy car ride, where bouncing up to the lever can be a tiny bit annoying, but again we can't die here, so we get it eventually. Then for the hardest part of the level, after making it to the orange car, the electricity on the wheel can't really be heard, so it's kind of down to luck how easily you can do this part. The bubbles make this next little part doable, then a bit more luck is used to make it underneath this car since it also doesn't really make any noise. But it's still not a problem. Then from here we ride one more car all the way down to the scoreboard, which is just as easy to drive as the rest of them, completing this one on our first try, and in less than 10 minutes. The motorbolts on the subways in Subway are pretty loud, so after the first elevator, it's super easy to find one to make it all the way to the lever. Then since these series of jumps require some precise timing, I decided to use the music again, where I turn it on as I get onto the subway, then wait for the saxophone to make its second noise to know when to jump. Where after the first obstacle, it's easy enough to time the rest on our own until reaching the checkpoint. For the second set of obstacles, The first hazard is close enough to time it without the music. Then since the rest of them don't have electricity, it's not too bad jumping over them using our own timing until reaching the checkpoint. Just as long as you know to space out the jumps enough. For the last subway, the score bubbles indicate when you reach the vents, which aren't too hard to get around. It's just the metal beams afterwards that can be tricky to get over. But with enough practice and some more luck, these really aren't that bad either. It even lets you go underneath them sometimes. Please. Please. Oh my god! That was so good. Then for the crane, you can just take as long as you need to find the car, which is made pretty easy by all of the different sound effects that it uses. Then this basically finishes the level. So after this final elevator ride, whose hazards are completely avoidable, we find the scoreboard, making for another pretty easy one. But the easy stuff quickly stops with the construction sites, which, up to this point in the story, ended up being the hardest level by far. But not for the reasons that you might think. The fireballs are a pretty major part of this level, but for the most part, they're not actually that bad. An easy way to get past the first set is to start running as soon as the level starts, dialogue jump, then start listening to the race timer once it opens, which we haven't actually used for this challenge yet, where after the third tick, you can jump over both fireballs, to then simply layer change to avoid the rest. For the second set, using the back and middle layer avoids everything. Then these metal beams are fine, until reaching the button and finding this platform that you need to swing around to get enough height off of. And this is one of the main things that makes this level so terrible. Because as I said at the start of the video, what makes LittleBigPlanet difficult in particular is its physics-based deterministic nature, where the smallest difference in a set of starting conditions can produce wildly different outcomes later on. This perfectly describes how these obstacles behave, with how important your movement and weight is for getting past them, where even the smallest error can lead to death, which then makes it even harder to do with the platform now having moved. There are 3 of these obstacles that we have to use in the level. And thankfully, the first one isn't actually too bad thanks to the score bubbles, and the ledge not being that high. So as long as you weigh it down at least a bit and jump off at the right time, it's usually fine. But then after jumping across this platform, we reach the other thing that makes this level difficult, the hammer enemies, that do not make distinct enough sounds to be able to tell which side the hammer is on. There are also 3 of these in the level, and again, the first one isn't that bad because there's a checkpoint right here. So if you die to the enemy, you can work out which side the hammer is on from that. The sponges are easy enough to swing across as long as you wait to grab the third one. Then getting onto the next platform to grab the winch is easy enough since nothing can kill you here, making it to the next fireball section. For this one, we only need to move in the way of the fireballs very briefly, since again, the middle layer is totally safe. So once against this wall, we can hear pretty clearly when each fireball falls and hits the metal down to the right. So using that, we can work out when a safe time to go is. We then pretty much do the exact same thing for the next 2 walls, except we're now listening for when each fireball falls down from the top left, since it's just easier to hear. Making it to the next section. This one's actually a lot easier, because after aligning with this wall, we can just go over everything by jumping for this sponge, where even if you miss it like I did, you can just move back to the middle layer until finding it from there. Then it's pretty easy to listen to the score bubbles, make it up to the elevator and past the basketball, which then starts what is easily the worst part of the level. The second hammer enemy is actually fine because you can just use the middle layer to be safe until killing it. It's the third one that causes a lot of problems because of how you have to get past not 1, but 2 of the swing platforms before taking the, basically, 50-50 chance to kill it, where getting it wrong takes you back to the bottom. Let's start with the second platform though. This is definitely the most annoying out of the 3 because of how there's only score bubbles in the middle, and the ledge is pretty high up. So there's really not a lot that you can do for this besides just practicing a lot. It took me a long time to really figure it out, but it can be good to align yourself to the right wall before going for it. The third platform is actually pretty nice because there are score bubbles just before it, and there's no need to move back and forth to get up. You just jump on, wait, then run up. Before going though, it's important to get an idea of where the third enemy is, so that when you make it up, it's on the other side. which you can do just by listening carefully to its volume. So about killing it, you could just try and get lucky and hope that the hammer won't be in the way, but I think it's worth understanding how it actually works to give yourself a better chance to potentially avoid needing to climb up again. So because the hammer is connected to a player sensor, it should actually be very easy to kill it, since it would have to be in the same position every time that you got up to it. But the problem with that is that the range for the player sensor includes the area before this, letting it turn on and move some amount before turning off again. So the strategy that I think ended up working the best was to try and spend as little time within the player sensor's range as possible, so that when we make it up to the ledge, it will more likely be in a position that we're expecting. So I don't know if I just got lucky, or if this actually worked, but I was eventually able to make it past the enemy semi-consistently, letting us attempt the rest of the level. The next checkpoint is pretty far away, so it can be pretty hard to do all of these next things without dying. Just another thing to make this level even harder. These platforms are fine to get past. Then for this set of fireballs, a good way to do it is to wait against this left wall, then start running upon hearing the rolling sound of the next spawn. Using this, you can then time the next jump with when you hear the next set of fireballs hit the floor. Then on the conveyor belt, there's no middle layer that we can use to cheat like the previous times. Or so it seems. By moving into the back layer against this wall, running off to the right actually lets you perfectly land on a hidden ledge, where then jumping very lightly moves you into the middle layer, where there's a path up to the next checkpoint that completely avoids the fireballs, which is all much easier than trying to jump against them on the conveyor. It can be a bit hard to time the jump into the middle layer though. But if you jump too low and don't realize it, you can just carefully run back to the left and try again. Then for the last set of fireballs, after collecting the prize bubbles, the sound of each fireball's lifetime ending can be heard by a pretty clear dissolve sound, which is the perfect thing to time our movement, with how it's directly connected to the emitter creating them. So after hearing the dissolve, we jump on, run for a moment, and do another jump, where we then wait for a second to do the final jump to avoid the last fireball getting in the way, making it to the boss fight. And so after all of that, the 3 boss enemies are thankfully not that hard to kill, where after getting onto the right side of the bounce pad, pushing it over for a second puts it in the perfect position to defeat the bouncer on the 3rd shot while pulling it to the right.
Yes, okay.
Then for the second enemy, we reset our position against the right wall, then push it over again for another second or so, where the 3rd shot is enough to kill him without us even moving. Then for Z-Dude, who happens to be the easiest, all we do is move over to the left wall, then wait for the 3rd shot, which easily defeats him.
Oh my god, finally!
This lets us finally walk over to the jet, climb up the stairs, and activate the scoreboard.
Oh my goodness.
So hopefully this shows why it took over 6.5 hours of attempts and practice to beat this level, with the majority of that time being spent on the section with the 2 platforms and enemies alone. I definitely wasn't expecting it to be this difficult. But anyway, it's finally time to move on from the Metropolis and onto the islands, where I don't expect the difficulty to ease up at all. So starting with Endurance Dojo, this level is pretty well known for its precise platforming and unforgiving obstacles, meaning it will probably be another pretty hard one. And unfortunately, I forgot to close the model's eyes on my successful attempt of it, but I swear I was still blindfolded. The first few jumps aren't too bad, as swinging off of things is always easy, but then we reach the first set of real platforms. But because of the number of them and how small they are, I decided that instead of trying to carefully jump to each platform one at a time, it was actually a lot better to just spam the jump button while holding left until getting lucky enough to get past. Which isn't even that bad to fail because it doesn't take long to get back to this point. Then the same thing is easy to do for the next platforms, even with grabbing the sponge. The ninja poles are fine since you only have to run across them. Timing the jump off isn't hard either. It's just that with these green wheels, you'll usually want to wait a while before letting go, in case you landed on top of it or something. But this is where we make it up to the sushi, which is definitely one of the most annoying things about this level. Kind of like in the construction site, it can just be really hard to work out exactly what the enemies are doing. where the only strategy that I found that works is to zoom in and listen for when they're close by, like we did in the mines. But then, there are also the moving platforms that we need to deal with. Thankfully though, the wobble bolts are loud enough and give us enough information to work out how they're moving. Because like winches, wobble bolts actually make a unique sound depending on which way it's rotating, with it playing a lower sound when it's moving clockwise, and a higher sound when it's moving anti-clockwise. We can then find the edge of the next platform by listening for the second sushi, where it won't be audible unless we're close enough. But instead of killing it, the layout of the platforms actually makes it easier to just jump to the third one straight away, where if the last sushi isn't in the way, it's not too hard to then jump to the checkpoint. I ended up killing it in my attempt, where it was still easy to listen for when the platform was moving upwards to then reach the checkpoint. That last enemy does start off being out of the way, but because of how each sushi's movement is just barely not synced to its platform, if you take too long, it'll eventually move into a bad spot. Then the set of green wheels are fine if you just take your time with them, where we then make it to the green platforms, which aren't so easy. The bubbles on each one help a lot though, and being able to listen to the wobble bolts makes it easy to time the run, where it can be a good idea to just skip the second last platform entirely. Then I actually went past the sensei and died a few times, but after she takes you upwards, it usually isn't too bad to run up the bridge and guess when to jump for the sushi, but I ended up using the music to time it just to be safe. These red wheels are super easy, then because these ninja poles are much longer than the previous ones, I ended up using the music again to time the jump off, where after playing it from the checkpoints, you can time the jump with the third note of the melody. Where we then have more moving sushi and rotating platforms. The strategy is pretty much the same as before though, where we zoom in, wait until hearing its legs, to then jump and kill it. But then because the next checkpoint is just to the left here, I found it better to completely jump over the next sushi instead of killing it, which the movement of the platform makes easy. But this is where we reach what is probably the worst part of the level. Another rotating beam, followed by 5 green platforms. I actually needed the music again here just because of how important it was to be in the right spot before jumping off of the beam, where after playing it, I jump on and run at the first click sound, then stop running after the next one. After this, you just have to wait a while until the green platform movement lines up with the beam that you're on, since you want to try and go straight after they spin around. Then after running and jumping off, it's just up to your skill and practice to somehow make it all the way up the 5 platforms without falling. Although the score bubbles do help a lot again, and I didn't even do it properly. I mean, I should have died after the 3rd platform, but I somehow got lucky enough for it to save me, completely skipping the 5th platform altogether. But that's not to say that it still didn't take me a lot of attempts to get this. Thankfully, the rest of the level is extremely easy, where after bouncing up and collecting these score bubbles, we can again take as much time as we need with the green wheels, pull on the lever an excessive amount until the elevator is definitely at the top, where to then finish the level, you don't even need to touch the red wheels, with how simply running off to the left immediately takes you all the way down to the sensei, letting us reach the scoreboard. And now for Sensei's Lost Castle, which I actually wished was as easy as Endurance Dojo, because oh my goodness, this one is just so brutal. And you already know why. It's the red spinning wheels. Before that though, we do have to use the catapult, which is easy since we don't need to move it. Then these ninjas aren't too bad with how we can hear when they jump. The green wheel is pretty big, so we can just grab it for a couple of seconds before letting go, to then jump up during a pretty big window, which leads us up to the first of 2 red wheel sections. The reason that these are so problematic is similar to the platforms in the construction site, where even though we aren't having to weigh anything down, Sackboy still needs to move in a very specific way to be able to progress, with a lot of it depending on how the physics decide to behave, since if you don't know, landing on and jumping from circular surfaces just isn't as consistent than if it was something flat. There at least isn't anything that can kill us in this room, but I still spent a lot of time here with how much I struggled to jump off of each wheel, and with how easy it is to fall all the way back down to the bottom. For the first one though, I found that by running from the left while holding grab, and letting go shortly after touching it easily gets you to the second wheel. Then, our strategy from the mines comes back, with how we can spam the jump button to listen for when we're standing on each one. But because of how fast the wheels spin, we can't do this on the cycle that we want to jump off. So this is where I wasted a lot of time because of how often I mistimed letting go or the jump off. But I eventually found that a good way to make the whole thing more consistent was to re-grab the wheel after letting go and just before jumping, basically forcing Sackboy to be firmly grounded for the moment he leaves the platform. I mean, this entire section is still really hard, and you do need to get lucky with avoiding the metal on the third and fourth wheels, but using this strategy let me make it to the top consistently. But also, for the last wheel, it actually spins slow enough that you can go on the same cycle as when you hear the jump sound.
Hey, that didn't take that long at all. Cool.
Then the enemy up here is pretty funny, because since it slowly moves to the left on its own, you can just wait in the middle layer until it defeats itself. We skip the balloons, then this green wheel is easy since you don't have to jump off of it. Then for the shurikens, after collecting this score bubble to find the starting points, I found that if you run after the second one makes its noise, you can make it through without stopping. Which then brings us to the second red wheel room, which is made so unbelievably harder than the first, with how there's now fire at the bottom of the room, and the wheels being attached to pistons, which we know we can't really listen to know what direction they're moving, meaning we really need a good strategy for this one. Thankfully, the next checkpoint is very close, and it's not actually too bad getting up to it, with how just by running off onto the first platform and holding grab, the wheel will consistently pick us up at the same moment during the piston cycle, which then, as long as we practice it, lets us time letting go and jumping off to reach the checkpoints. But now this is the hard part, with how the next wheel does not move low enough to grab without jumping, and that we also need to be on the edge of the platform to reach it. The only good thing about this is that you can tell when you're not far enough over by listening to the spring bolt. But what's bad is how big the window for grabbing the wheel is with how long it lingers in front of us, which might sound like a good thing, since it does increase our chances of reaching it. But it's actually not, because we want to grab it at a specific moment so that the piston can be in the right position when we want to jump off, which can actually be said about the rest of the wheels too, since if you mistime something, or lose track of the cycle, it's basically impossible to find it again without falling down. So this makes the strategy as follows. You move over and start jumping until grabbing the wheel, hoping that you grabbed it as early as possible. Then after spamming jump and hearing Sackboy stand up once, you get ready to let go and jump off on the next cycle, getting you to the next wheel. Then if you wanted, you could try and jump to the next wheel as soon as Sackboy starts standing on this one, but because I found timing that really hard, this is where I started counting the cycles with every time that Sackboy was able to jump, where after the 7th one, the wheels line up again to go for it. Then for the final wheel, you can jump off after the first cycle of hearing Sackboy stand, but I ended up falling back down to the previous wheel. So because there's basically no way of knowing where the pistons are at this point, the only thing that you can really do is to just try jumping off the wheel and hoping that you make it to the final one again, which thankfully worked for me. You can tell when you're on the last one because of how the camera will move when you're at the top, making everything a lot quieter.
Oh yeah, now we're on the last one.
Which is actually super useful for timing the jump off too, with how we now finally have a sound to tell us what the pistons are doing. So because we know that the piston takes 8 seconds to fully cycle, we can wait until we hear the camera move, start counting in seconds, then once we hear that Sackboy is going to be able to jump around when we count to 8, we can go for it, which is exactly what ended up working for me.
1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Did we do it? Finally? Oh my god.
Making it take over 6 hours to reach this part of the level for the first time, where thankfully that is the hardest part done, but we're still only about halfway through the level. This next sponge is pretty easy to get over if you're careful, then if you listen to the zipline closely, you can hear when the rubber hits the wall to then let go.
Okay, good. Great.
The ninja section is also not really a problem, with how you can just jump after hearing the second one make a noise, Then move to the front layer after hearing the last one's high-pitched noise.
Oh. Okay, that's fine.
But now we have more wheels. They're not nearly as bad as the red wheels, but they can still be very annoying with how easy it is to accidentally touch any of the fire and completely lose where you are. We tried a lot of things with intentionally getting hit by the fire to know when to jump, but what ended up working the best was to listen to the score bubbles closely to know when to go to the next wheel, going sooner rather than later to avoid the fire, and stalling for a moment if you do accidentally touch it. Miraculously, this ended up working to get us through this section first try, which I really wasn't expecting, with this being the next hardest part after the red wheels.
Oh my god! Oh my god! How lucky was that? Oh my god!
But now for the sumo fights. As long as you kill the right one as soon as it comes down, it makes everything pretty easy, which isn't hard to time. I ended up getting into the middle layer by mistake, but it's actually a great position to be in with how they jump into you. Then it's not hard to time killing the second one with how loud its jump is, where I happened to make it into the middle layer again, to then finish the fight. Then the boss is surprisingly easy too. After hearing the dissolve break, it's important to get the 2 brains on the bottom, but after that it's not too difficult to do the rest with how easy it is to make it to the lamps, and with how safe it is in the corners and the middle layer. You can even guess pretty well what the sumo's legs are doing just by listening to the volume of the slam sound. So I ended up getting the next 2 brains pretty quickly, where I then just jumped around until making it back up for the last one. Then the ninja room pretty much has no danger, so you can just keep trying stuff, where doing the speedrun strategy isn't even difficult. Then after releasing the cat, all that's left to do is grab onto the zipline and ride it to the end.
Oh my god.
Completing what I think is the hardest level up to this point. I know that the timer says the construction site took longer, but there was about 50 minutes of practice that we did that wasn't counted for Sensei's Lost Castle, so I think this one took longer overall. And now for the Terrabaloni's Volcano, which I'm happy to say is the easiest islands level. But that doesn't mean that it still didn't take a while to figure out. Getting over to the first fortress isn't very hard, with how you can just fly all the way up, and then move to the right to make it. Then once we've landed and made it in, I like to grab the lamp here to make sure I don't run too far. Then these pistons can be kind of hard to hear when they move, but by zooming in it makes it a lot easier. Then on the bottom level, these walls are really useful with how we can move back a layer to align with them, to then kill the first ninja after it jumps. For the second one though, I found it best to zoom in and listen to find exactly where it is that way. Getting up to the lever is easy, then because the airship's checkpoint has so many lives, it's a lot more convenient to just death abuse here instead of climbing back up. Flying over to the next fortress is more of the same, except now we fly to the right before going up. And using the lantern to align ourselves to the middle of the room is still useful. All of the pistons here are synced, so it's very easy to hear when they move, letting us get past the first set, to then drop down and move back at the second. While we're in the back layer, we can find where the next jump is by touching the fire against the wall, to then jump across at the right time. Then we pretty much do the same thing for the last pistons, except we can use the score bubbles to find the edge. Then it's the same as before for pulling the lever and getting back to the ship. Flying to the top of the volcano is pretty straightforward. You just move up and right until hearing the sensei, then float down until hearing all of the jumping fire that's at the bottom, which then starts the hard part of the level, with how after reaching this checkpoint, the next one isn't found until the boss fight. This fire makes a lot of noise, so it's easy to get past the first obstacle. Then the score bubbles tell you when you can jump over the next fire, and also when you land from the jump. And even though I did do this first try on my completed attempt, I died here a lot before fully understanding it, since it's very easy to not jump far enough. Then we have these 2 wheels, which I was honestly stumped on for a while, as it didn't seem like they made any useful or consistent sounds to tell us where they were in the cycle, apart from the fire itself, which you could hear by zooming in and getting very close to.
Oh, what?
But that stopped being possible for some of the later jumps. We tried to use the sound of the jumping fire too, but because that's connected to a player sensor, it isn't consistent. But that's when I realized that the second wheel actually makes a loud collision sound at a specific moment during its cycle, which is just the perfect thing to make this section so much easier, especially with how both wheels are basically synced. So after making it up to the first one, we run and jump after hearing the sound to go over the fireball and climb up the stairs. It can be a bit tricky spacing these next two jumps, but if we again go after hearing the collision and listen for the score bubbles, we can do both of them at once while avoiding the fire. Okay, then it's pretty easy to jump over the next fire and climb up to the next wheel, with the score bubbles telling you when to stop. It's a bit different here though, because instead of going straight after we hear the sound, we need to wait a couple of seconds before going. Where after climbing up and getting the prize bubbles, the same thing applies for the final jump, letting us make it to the boss. And this is where I was really stupid, because after all of that and finally making it to this area for the first time, I hadn't really practiced it at all, and I had no idea how far away the wooden platforms were from the checkpoint. So I promptly lost all but one of my lives to both the fire and the knife, until getting extremely lucky and making it to the stone platform, while on the verge of getting a game over, where we still needed to pull the lever enough to win. Thankfully though, the time to move to and from the lever is so generous, and the area safe from the boss is so big, it actually made it possible for me to do the entire rest of the fight without dying once, having to pull the lever a total of 7 times before the cat moved in range to defeat the Oni, which is just so amazing to me. I nearly did die a few times on the run back too. I mean, it wouldn't have been too bad to do the level again since I had it pretty figured out by that point, but I'm just so glad that I was able to finish it there and then, letting us finally complete this monster of a world, which has definitely been the hardest overall so far, to now move on to the temples, which hopefully will give us a bit of a break. Almost the entirety of the Dancer's Court is made up of pistons moving platforms in repetitive cycles. But with how flat and slow they are, it really shouldn't be too bad. So after climbing these stairs and bouncing off the shopkeeper, we find the first moving platform. As we know, we can't really identify what direction a piston is moving by the sound alone. So after we hear it stop moving, we just have to take a gamble and try running onto it, where if we die, we can run straight on after respawning. But now that we're on the first platform, we can easily keep track of the next few since they're all synced. So we collect the score bubbles on the second platform, jump the fire onto the third once we hear the piston stop moving, run onto the fourth platform after the next movement, to then jump the next fire once the piston starts moving again, making it to the checkpoint. For some reason the wobble bolts on the dancer are extremely quiet, but we can tell when she moves downwards by being able to grab her. So then when she stops being grabbable, it's our cue to run up, jump to move back a layer, then jump again to go forward, where after a couple of seconds we can run and jump off. This is another section where we have to sacrifice a life to get onto the first platform if we get unlucky, which isn't too bad because once we're on it, it becomes super easy. The way the score bubbles are laid out horizontally make them the perfect tool to time each jump, where once we hear Sackboy collect the fourth one on each platform, we can go. The last one is a bit different, but it's still easy. These wobble bolts are much easier to hear compared to the last ones, but because half of them spin in the opposite direction as the rest, they effectively cancel out each other's sound, making it impossible to tell what point in their cycle any of them are at. So again, we just have to pick a random time to go, hoping that we won't die. But if we do, we can work out the cycle from there, so it's not that bad. Then after running across the arms, it's easy to time the jump off using the score bubbles. Then this is where we reach one of the worst parts of the level. Not only are there 6 different platforms that all move in different directions before reaching the checkpoints, but this is also where I discovered a bug with the piston sound effects, which only serves to make the whole thing just that much harder. For whatever reason, while you're near the bouncy snake, it causes the pistons to the right to play their sound effects several times during a single movement. It seems very random, but while a piston is moving, it can just play the moving sound as many times as it wants to. It could play 4 times, or it might only play once. Either way, it makes it extremely hard to know when the piston has actually stopped moving, which is pretty annoying with how we already get such limited information from them, and now, the information that we do get is broken. I'm guessing it's being caused by the camera moving them off screen or something, but I'm not sure. It's not impossible to work out when the pistons stop, so after listening carefully enough, we can take a shot at jumping to the first platform, where again, we just have to take a chance at which point the piston has stopped at. Once finally getting onto the platform though, the sound effect stops being broken, making it not too difficult to move onto the second platform, then the third, jump the fire, then move across the two vertically moving platforms, with the score bubbles helping immensely throughout the whole thing. Once making it to the circle, we just have to wait a few seconds before running off, as the window to do so is pretty big. It was at this point that we discovered that if you can get close enough to certain pistons, zooming the camera in actually makes the retracting sound become muffled, while the extending sound stays clear. Letting us pretty easily identify where certain platforms are. So after we hear it finish retracting, we run on and fall straight down to the second platform, where we can then immediately jump to the next. Then after we hear the wobble bolts in the area stop moving, we can go to the last platform, to then make it to the next checkpoint after a few more seconds. And now for this next part, where despite how late we are into this challenge, we're actually going to be using a completely new tech to help us make it through. Because with how many pistons there are moving at different times here, there's just no way to work out when it's safe to go. But not unless we use stickers. We have had to place stickers in some earlier levels to progress, but we've never really used them to learn about our surroundings. Which we can do here because of the fact that there's no wall behind the platform's up position, where it makes the error sound if we try to place a sticker here. This means that by using our puppet cursor, we can work out when the platform has moved up by finding the point on the screen, where placing a sticker goes back and forth between making the error and success sound effects. So then, since the 5 pistons here are synced, after we hear the sticker get placed, we can close the menu and start running, where if we're fast enough we can make it to the third platform without stopping, letting us reach the checkpoint. We could probably do the same thing for this next part, but I ended up just guessing when to run and using the death to guarantee making it on the second try. But once we make it to the right, we do have to go back to using the stickers, with the number of specific jumps that we need to do, and how, again, the constant movement of the pistons makes it impossible to learn anything by their sound alone. And keep in mind that the only reason this is possible is because the background is exposed here. So while against the wall, we move the sticker up and left until finding the first platform's retracted position, where once we can tell when it's about to extend again, we can close the menu and jump onto it. We then do the exact same thing to find the next fire platform, but while using the wire material above to know how far to move the cursor, since otherwise we wouldn't really be able to differentiate the wood and the fire. Then once finding it, we try to do the jump right as the platform starts to retract. Oh, that was a good sound. Then, thankfully, the final jump for the area is identical to the last, meaning that we can do it quite easily, and I don't need to bother explaining it. Now at this point, there's still about a third of the level left, which seems crazy since we've already done so much. So because of that, and the rest of the level looking really difficult, especially the race section, I decided to attempt the skip for the level instead, which is still quite challenging to do while blindfolded, but it just felt like the better option. The hard part is getting a jump off the snake's head to make it out of bounds. So to do that, I carefully use the middle layer to get behind it, then if you listen closely, you can hear when its head hits the ground on each cycle. Perfect for timing the first jump with. It is kind of random how much height it will give you, but after everything was set up, I tried it, and ended up getting to the platform on the first try. Albeit only barely with how weird the jump off was. But the great thing about being up here is that it's pretty much impossible to fall back down as long as you're careful. So all that we have to do is run into this corner, and keep throwing out jumps until managing to slide up this ledge, where we can check if we made it by running to the right and spamming jump, where if we hear the sound effects play quickly, it means that we're still on the lower platform. Then once we're here, all that's left is to continuously attempt the right corner jump until making it over the wall, where again, there's no risk of losing progress. So after making it up, we can finally fall down effortlessly to the scoreboard to complete the level. Making for another pretty hard one, but definitely not as bad as some of the previous levels. And thankfully, Elephant Temple is even easier. It starts off with listening for the closed level post, to then jump a few times until making it over to the first checkpoint. The next 6 jumps can be timed pretty well using the sound of the score bubbles, but if not, the pistons work too. Then after the stairs, even though the piston itself can't be used to hear where the platform is, the movement actually creates a sliding sound, but only when the piston retracts, letting us easily jump on at the right time to climb up the rest. Then after climbing more stairs and making it to the monkey block, it's not actually that hard to just pull it over a bit, climb the stairs again, and jump from the 3rd step to make it all the way out of the room. Once getting onto the green box, there isn't a lot that we can do for the piston. So like the dancer's court, we just have to randomly pick a time to go, where if we die, we can hopefully keep track of it from there. Thankfully the button makes a noise when you press it, and swinging off of the sponge is easy since the piston cycle doesn't matter for it. These pillars are usually kind of annoying with the fire, but because each one has its own player sensor, it's very easy to know exactly where you are by listening for each piston, letting us pretty easily make it past. But instead of a checkpoint, there's another obstacle. These moving boxes would probably be a bit annoying to deal with, but like one of the earlier pistons, for some reason they only create a sliding sound effect half of the time. So all that we have to do is wait until the sliding sound is about to stop, where we can then hold right to make it to the checkpoint, which then starts what is probably the hardest part, but it's nothing worse than what we've already had to deal with. Again, these moving platforms might be a challenge to deal with if the sounds of the pistons were all that we had, but because there's just a random collision sound that happens on every other movement, it makes it very easy. It's pretty quiet from over here, but after we hear it, we can run onto the first platform, to then use the other piston sounds to time our movement. Then for the next set, we do the first jump on the movement after the collision noise, then walk to the next platform as it happens again, to then jump off after another even number of cycles, where then just holding right lets you make it through. We have to be careful though because there isn't a checkpoint until after these platforms. But as long as we use the score bubbles to find the edge, it's not an issue. After pulling the lever, I considered using another player to climb up so that we could skip jumping back altogether, but I was too worried about messing something else up, so I just did it normally. Doing the jumps over to the next lever isn't so bad by using the score bubbles, but since they're gone on the way back, you just have to practice and memorize how far the platforms are. Then since these boxes only make the sliding sound when they move horizontally too, it's again not that hard to time your movement to make it to the prize bubble if you have to then run over to the checkpoint. The boxes are actually in sync with the wave section after this, so we'll be using them to time our movement for the next section too. My plan was to fall down after the sliding noise stopped, putting us at the top of a wave, where after a few seconds of running, we just try dropping down a few times to avoid the 2 pieces of fire in the back layer, fire boosting off the middle or front if we needed. This isn't really what happened at all though, with how quickly I lost speed and became disoriented, to the point where I was just doing random movements in the hopes that I wouldn't die. And so because this area isn't really that dangerous, we luckily made it down to the key area, where we can actually hear the movement of the next boxes in the level, which are also in sync with the waves, so we can use that to get out and make it to the checkpoints. Then it's pretty easy to run across the top of these ones and just fire boost, making it to the elephants. Thankfully there's not a whole lot that you need to do for this part, but because I didn't really practice making it up to the button at all, which isn't even that hard to do, it cost me 2 deaths before being able to press it, where I then promptly lost another by jumping off too early, bringing me down to my last life. This wouldn't really be an issue at this point with how easy the rest is, but because I spawned while the checkpoint was behind a wall, the automatic layer change onto the elephant was blocked, making me land on a tiny platform at the back, where I obviously then fell off, but I didn't die. I actually managed to change layer onto one of the pieces inside of the elephant, which I had absolutely no idea had all happened, because since I was somehow still alive, I just assumed that I was still on top of the elephant. But then, when it came time to finish the level, I started to realize that something was wrong.
Where am I? Am I screwed?
Since this had pretty much never happened to me, I had basically no idea what could have happened or where I was. All I knew was that I was completely stuck somehow. And since I didn't have any lives left, I was just gonna give up, look at what happened, and restart the level. But 1 second before I took the blindfold off, I remembered that if a new player spawns into a level, the game will let them spawn in even if the checkpoint doesn't have any lives, where it even adds a life to the checkpoint for that player. So that's exactly what I did.
Dang, if only I had one more life and I could... Oh, wait, is this cheating? Is it cheating if I do this?
By simply spawning another player, I was able to gain another life to safely hold to retry and finish the level. The funny thing is though, you can literally do this at any point in any level to add on extra lives to a checkpoint, where since there are 3 extra players that can join a level, it's possible to get up to 3 additional lives once per restart. Since remember, it only works for the first time a new player joins an instance. You can't spawn and despawn them over and over to get infinite lives. But just like in speedrunning, since there aren't any rules against spawning additional sack people, this is a completely valid strategy. It's really just kind of a lifeline that we can use if we ever need it. It's just a shame that it took me this long to remember. The only thing is that it doesn't work on double life checkpoints for whatever reason, and that splitting up the extra lives across multiple checkpoints doesn't work as well. Because, for example, if you only spawn the second extra player at a particular checkpoint to get 1 extra life, you'll only have 1 extra life remaining for your main player to use instead of 2, because of how, to be able to spawn the 3rd and 4th players, you first need to spawn the 2nd player again, which ends up using a life since at this point they're no longer a new player in the level. But anyway, time to finish the temples. For the start of the Great Magician's Palace, we can do the same thing that the speedrun does, where just running to the right gets us past the first set of blocks. Thankfully we can hear when any of them spawn too, so it's easy to know when to start running for the second set, where I found that after running into the first tall block, jumping off of it and then doing the same thing for the next block that Sackboy runs into, gets you through this section pretty fast. There's not really any danger in this part. Then we find these blocks that don't make a sound when they spawn, which is a little inconvenient, but they do still make a sound when they despawn. So by zooming in, we can hear clearly when the first block disappears, which makes for good timing to run and jump off the ledge, to then jump one more time to make it across. You can basically just hold right to make it through the next section, and then the section after that is almost the same thing, where I use the sound of each block falling as the cue to move slightly right. For the block spawner, I was originally only trying to place a few of them in specific spots, but there's really no downside to just spawning as many as possible to make it completely safe. I just lost the button a few times. Then this is definitely the hardest section of the level, with how we need to do 5 precise jumps in a row within a pretty small time limit, and without any score bubbles. A good way to start it off though is to zoom the camera in to hear exactly when the first block spawns, where unfortunately it's then just down to skill and practice. But thankfully it only took me 2 attempts, although I did come very close to dying. Then afterwards you just run to the left. The fireballs go back to making things pretty easy with the sound effects that plays whenever one spawns, giving a pretty obvious indication of when to jump. The first one even saved me with how far away I was from the ledge, but even the group of 2 is fine. For these falling blocks, because just holding right pretty much always gets you through most of it, my plan was to run and just wait for a second if I happened to get burnt, which worked perfectly. Thankfully, we don't need to complete the falling block section. Then these fireballs are pretty much the same as the last ones. We can even use the middle layer to completely avoid the first, but the fact that we have to swing off something doesn't make it much harder, letting us make it all the way to the sliding boxes. There's no danger with these things, so you can always get past eventually. Then it's the same story for the final fireballs, again being able to use the middle layer to stay completely safe from them. And so with that, we now just walk all the way to the right to get transported to the wilderness, completely finishing the temples, which overall wasn't that hard for such a late world. But that's something that we're really going to appreciate going into these final 4 levels of the game. which you should already know are not going to be easy. Well, maybe except for the first one, as the Frozen Tundra is probably the easiest level that we've had since Lowrider. After riding the dog sled, which is very easy, the main obstacle of the level are these icicles, where after making it down to the bottom, the score bubbles and the generous size of each platform let me make it over in only a few attempts. You can just run past the next icicles, but then we reach where we would normally deload this checkpoint to skip most of the level, which I did consider not doing, but because our only goal is to finish each level, I decided to just use it to save time, as I didn't really like the idea of having to climb up these platforms. So after doing the deload and falling out of bounds, just by walking to the left we find ourselves at the end of the ice slide, where we meet up with the soldier not long after that. The final obstacle of the level are these two enemies, the first of which is a bit annoying, because of how it has two wobble bolts that move in opposite directions, meaning we can't listen for where the electricity is, and that we just need to take a guess for when to kill it. Thankfully I got lucky, where the next enemy isn't as bad, but you still need to just hope that the arms won't be in the way when you go for its middle brain. Once it's defeated though, we can go back to the soldier, use him to open the door, and finish the level in less than 10 minutes, letting us now finally reach what is likely the most infamously difficult part of the game, the bunker. To start off, these hazards with the 12 pistons play a sound effect when extended, so it's easy to jump past when they're down. Then, unlike before, the first enemy only uses one wobble bolt, meaning we're able to listen for where the electricity is to kill it. After this there are more hazards like the one at the start, so after hearing the first one retract, we just have to run to the right and try to time a jump onto the third one to make it to the checkpoint. Then after another enemy, that we annoyingly just have to get lucky for, we reach the first big wheel that we're supposed to go inside of, which is a recurring thing in this level. Thankfully, since there isn't any hazards on the inner surface, I found this pretty nice strategy, where after holding right and hearing these score bubbles get collected, you can jump to the other half of the wheel, where if you then just keep on jumping, you'll eventually automatically make it out to reach the checkpoint. As long as you don't run too fast, the next section is fine to do with how easy it is to listen for the wobble bolt's pitch. Then the same thing is done to know when to kill the next enemy, after it makes the deeper sound. Then for this part we just have to take a guess for when the correct time to go is. But if we die we can work out the right time since the cycles are consistent, where we then use the sponge to safely make it through the rest. For the rotor tubes though, if you wanted you could go after the wobble bolts finish spinning in either direction, but it's much easier to go after the clockwise movement, which is signaled by the low pitch sound, so that by the time you're leaving the second tube, it'll be rotating anti-clockwise, letting you run up into the air to reach the ledge, instead of into the electricity, where you just count the score bubbles to know when to jump. We then reach these 5 pistons, which are a pretty significant obstacle, but they're not nearly as hard to get past as they could have been, because of how the first one makes a super loud noise whenever it extends. And since all of the pistons are synced, we can use this sound to pretty much time everything. So after hearing the noise, we can wait a couple of seconds before going to beat the first piston. Then the exact same thing applies for the next one, except the timing is a bit earlier, and it can be hard to land safely, but it's fine. For the third piston, we can run and jump straight after hearing the noise, making it past the fourth one too, where we then use the score bubbles to know when to stop. Then the final piston moves at the same time as the first, except it's inverted. So we just run and jump again right after we hear the noise to make it to the checkpoint. This leads into one of my least favorite parts of the level, which is this group of 3 enemies, although it's only the middle one that really causes problems. It isn't that hard to kill the first enemy by listening for the wobble bolt again, but the sound of the second one can make it pretty hard to identify with how much faster its arms move. Then once we do kill the first one, we again just have to use dumb luck and hope that we happen to get its brain without losing all of our lives, which is made even harder with the ledge that it's on, where if you jump at the wrong time, you just die without even getting a chance to defeat it. And we also can't zoom in to listen for anything with how high up the enemy is. If you were really observant, you could probably keep track of its arms after dying to them, but it can be hard with how far the checkpoint is. So I can't tell you how many runs I lost to this enemy just from getting super unlucky. On my last attempt though, I was able to kill it using only one death. The enemy after this thankfully isn't a problem, where to find the next ledge I would align myself with this wall, then time a run to the right. We then once again listen for the wobble bolt, where after it makes the high-pitched sound and we hear the car stop moving, we can go to land on it, to then run and jump off after we collect around 6 of the score bubbles. These windmill obstacles are another thing that seem pretty bad at first, with how there aren't really any noises unique to any part of the cycle, but it's actually pretty doable with the right strategy. By zooming in near the ledge, we can actually hear each time the electricity goes past. And because all 3 obstacles are synced, we can run and jump straight after one of the hazards go by, and make it through the whole thing without stopping, while using the score bubbles to help time the rest of the jumps. The next enemy doesn't need to be killed, so at first I would just jump at it and hope that I would reach the checkpoints. But after dying once and having to redo the last section, I found that a better strategy is to get against this wall by holding grab, zoom in, then jump to the right as the enemy is heard getting close. Which thankfully worked every time. We now have another wheel, which this time does have hazards on the inside of it. But funnily, it's not that hard to completely avoid going in, which is good because there aren't a lot of ways to know its orientation either. The strategy I found was to zoom the camera in again, to then start holding right while grabbing. With this, once the gap in the wheel comes around, Sackboy will immediately start grabbing the wall, which once we hear, we can let go and move slightly left to ride the outside of the wheel all the way over to the other side, with our success being indicated by this prize bubble. Then from here, all we have to do is hold left, where we eventually make it back into the wheel at the end of its cycle, taking us down all the way to the conveyor belt. Which, for me, is the one part that made this level so unbearable. Seriously, this conveyor belt, and whatever might come after it, makes the entire rest of the level seem like a walk in the park with how much more difficult it is. Which is annoying because it does still take a good amount of effort to get up to this point. The biggest problem with this section is that it's practically impossible to know where the first set of pistons are without either getting super lucky or sacrificing at least one life. You can hear the movement of the pistons from the checkpoints, but because of how they're synced, there's always at least one moving, making the sound pretty much useless, especially with how there's no way to know which direction any of them are moving either. The only good thing about this part is how we aren't being forced straight onto the conveyor, and that we can wait before dropping down, where you might think that a single death is all it would take to know where everything is, but because of the pause that each piston does after moving, the window for dying becomes pretty big, making it impossible to know exactly where in the cycle the pistons are, since you could have died as soon as the piston came down, or right before it was going to go back up. There's just no way of knowing. And it might not seem like much, but that variation in time can make a big difference. So this is the best strategy that I was able to come up with. You randomly pick a time to drop down, hoping that you get lucky enough to make it past the first 2 pistons without moving, where if you die, you drop down again immediately after respawning. Because of the relationship between the conveyor belt speed and the cycle of the pistons, doing this will put you on the next piston cycle, but slightly ahead of where you died in the cycle last time. So theoretically, with enough deaths your position in the cycle will gradually be adjusted until you're able to make it past the first 2 pistons, where in the rare case of dying to the second piston, which you can listen for, it's not a bad idea to move slightly right after getting onto the conveyor belt to not die to the first one again. So this is where it's great if you can avoid using the extra lives until this point in the level, because it gives you a much bigger chance of surviving, with having more attempts at getting lucky. But anyway, the great thing about getting past the second piston without moving is that it now lets you know exactly where the rest of the obstacles are in their cycles. So now that we have that, this is where we need to use the music to time the rest, as we still have to deal with a lot of moving objects. Although this part of the level only has 2 instrument tracks playing. The way I arranged it was, I play the music as we drop down onto the conveyor, and just before these 3 descending notes in the melody play, I move slightly left. which gets us past the third and fourth pistons. Then in the song, before a long pause, there are 2 notes that descend, which after hearing, I attempt jumping over both lights, one after another. From here, we don't need to move to avoid the next piston, but we have to move a bit left again after hearing the next 2 descending notes. Where shortly after this, we're free to run and jump to the right up to the checkpoints, completing one of the hardest sections in the game after 6.5 hours of trying.
Oh my god.
Which I unfortunately had to do a total of 3 times before I was able to complete the next section. Because yeah, this isn't even the end of the level, as you probably all know. But I'm just glad that I never died to the light at the end of the conveyor. So yeah, we're now up to the most famously difficult obstacle in all of LittleBigPlanet. Something that doesn't even come close to anything that we've already had to deal with. Unofficially referred to as the Wheel of Death. So, like, with how long it just took to only do the conveyor belts, I genuinely think that getting through the wheel might actually just be physically and mentally impossible for me to do while blindfolded. At least as intended anyway. I think you'd have to cheat it a bit by running along the roof until falling down at the end to have any chance. So not to be anticlimactic, but because of that, and the second conveyor belt afterwards, which is even worse than the first, we are going to be using a skip by using a deload, which still isn't even that easy to do. So we pull the lever, activate the wheel's checkpoints, then perform the deload, which removes the collision of the barbed wire material. This is where you can then go back, grab part of the wheel, and let go to land in the back layer, where there's a path to the scoreboard. But because of how easy it is to accidentally change the layer back into the wheel, combined with how spawning from the checkpoint puts you inside of it as well, I struggled to do this section a lot, and was the reason why I had to do the conveyor belt 3 times before finishing. The first time I made it here, I was actually able to keep all of my extra lives, but because of how nervous I was, I ended up messing up the menuing, which then led to the level crashing because of a modded costume I was wearing that's kind of broken, which was pretty frustrating. But we kept going anyway, where I tried using a strategy where I would count how long I was holding onto the wheel for, but it didn't really work. It was only until the wheel just kind of dropped me off in the exact spot that I wanted when we made progress. Where from here you can jump to the right, then very slowly walk off the ledge until hearing the sounds of the second conveyor, where jumping saves you from getting stuck out of bounds. Then, to avoid the final piece of electricity, we run to the right until the conveyor becomes quiet, move into the middle layer, then run right while holding R1 to get against this wall, to then finally drop down to activate the scoreboard, after over 7 hours of trying.
Oh, thank you. Thank you. Oh my god.
This is definitely what I think is the worst level in the game up to this point. Almost entirely because of the first conveyor belt, and how late into the level it is, combined with how annoying the final trick can be. I know I fell out of bounds at least twice after finally getting past the wheel. There's actually a lot of ways to get stuck in this area. It just does not stop until you activate the scoreboard. And yeah, sorry for not doing the Wheel of Death, but I didn't really want to spend another 100 hours doing this level. But with all of that done, we can now move on to the second last level of the game, which can't be as bad as this one, right? The Collector's Lair might be the level that I spent the most time practicing before even doing attempts, just because of the number of different sections that there are. But I think that those 3 hours were worth it because we ended up getting through the level a lot faster than I thought we would. Before doing the level, I thought the beginning might be the worst section, but it's actually not that bad. The music conveniently doesn't play until you start falling, so using that, I would hold left at the start, then after hearing the second guitar riff play, I would hold right, wait until hearing the prize bubble, to start holding left again, then use the sound of the score bubbles to know when to go right. Then this is the hard part, where you just have to use skill to make it back into the middle, and use the sound of the bubbles to move around the last few obstacles. It's totally doable though, especially with how you can just keep restarting until it works. Freeing the bears and getting the SD card to open the door is pretty easy, where we then reach the first proper section of the level. Like the Dancer's Court, this level is made up of a lot of pistons that we can't hear the direction of. But because the background is open in this area, it's the perfect opportunity to use the sticker tech again to find exactly where the platforms are in their cycle. So as the next one is moving towards us, we run and jump to easily fall into the box. After landing, we wait for the next piston movement to jump to the right, where if we then wait a moment before continuing to run, it eventually lets us make it all the way to the dog. Now we just jump when we hear the score bubbles, putting us on this platform, where it's then pretty easy to time the next two jumps with the cycles to reach the checkpoints. From here, you can usually just hold right to make it all the way to the sponge. But in my attempt, I happened to fall inside of the metal. I didn't really have a strategy for this situation, but I was able to get out eventually and use the score bubbles to find where I was. Once you are beneath the sponge, you can keep jumping until getting it, where again, just listening to the cycles, it's easy to swing up and jump to the checkpoint. Now I don't think that these platforms are synced with the next metal ones, so there is a bit of luck involved here, but I found that doing a light jump followed by two big ones was usually able to get me over. We then reach what is definitely the hardest part of the level, where we have about 9 jumps in a row that we not only have to time precisely with the cycles, but the jumps themselves are also pretty tight. The score bubbles at least help a bit though. To start it off, I move into the back while holding R1, so that when I run to the right I end up aligned with this wall. If you really wanted, you could probably use the stickers again to find where the cycles are here, but since the platform that we're on is moving, it makes it a bit hard, so I ended up just sacrificing a life if I needed to. From here we can move forward, and wait 2 piston moves before trying to jump to the next platform. Then after landing here, I usually wait until the 3rd next piston move until doing the next jump, which is probably the hardest part of this section just with the placement of everything. I would always just jump too far by mistake. The next 2 jumps aren't too bad though, where we just wait for the pistons to move twice before doing them. Once reaching this big block though, we have to wait an odd number of movements before going. And then once on the first tall platform, we wait an even number again for the next 2 jumps. Then after making it here, it's pretty free, where even if you don't jump at all like I accidentally did, the staircase is so big and easy to go up that as long as you land somewhere on it, you'll probably be fine. And so after nearly 2 hours of trying, and using all of my extra lives, I was finally able to get through this part for the first time. And although that was the hardest part of the level, there's still a lot to go. Thankfully, these rotating things are probably the easiest part of the level, since just by holding right the entire time, you're able to make it past all of them, getting down to the checkpoints. This next part is kind of funny because even though the pistons don't give us enough information to know exactly when to drop down, it doesn't actually matter with how the wall of the moving platform happens to align itself perfectly with the wall that we're against, meaning that we can attempt the drop down after any piston movement and will never die. Then after making it in and jumping over this, it's actually very easy to make it through the rest with how as long as you don't stop moving, it's very hard for the fire to kill you. Then the rest of this section is just more holding right and jumping until you happen to make it up, since it's really not as dangerous as it looks, where we then drop down after reaching the magician, making it to the next difficult section. It was a bit hard to figure out the best way to get past these next 3 platforms with how easy it can be to fall down. But what actually helped a lot with it was the fire, and how good it is at conserving speed. So what we do is, we again use a sticker and the background to identify the position of the cycle, where once the platform that we're on is about to move left, we start running. With this, we get a ton of speed and the perfect height from the fire boost to reach the next platform, while collecting all of the score bubbles. We keep going until hearing the 5th bubble get collected, putting us in a position to drop down, which we do after hearing another 2 piston movements. Then all we have to do is keep moving left enough on the cycles to finally jump and reach the checkpoints. Even though it is challenging, I think this section probably looks harder than it really is, as I found it to be pretty consistent. The biggest problem with the strategy is that it relies heavily on the score bubbles. So the first attempt is really the only good one that you get, which I thankfully was successful with, but unfortunately, this exact problem applies to the next few sections too. We can just drop down here, then we have to carefully move to the right until collecting this prize bubble. We have the same issue here as in the rest of the level, where we don't really know where the pistons are, where I don't think using stickers would help either. But it doesn't matter too much, because I ended up finding a strategy that works no matter what position the platforms are in. By running and jumping as the platform moves, you'll either make it all the way across, where you can just jump again to reach the checkpoint, or you'll end up landing on the middle platform, where you can also just jump again to make it to safety. You just have to react based on what you hear, which is what we've been doing this whole time anyway. The next section actually lets us find the pistons pretty easily, which is good because we need to know exactly where they are. By getting against this wall, you can drop down after a movement, where depending on whether you collected the score bubble or not, can tell you what the platforms are doing. So we keep trying this until collecting it, where we then wait one more movement before running and jumping. From here, I originally tried to continue listening to the pistons to know when to jump onto the next platform, but it actually ended up being much easier to instead listen for when Sackboy started running on the metal to know when to change directions, which let me make it all the way up, although I did nearly die. Once reaching this checkpoint, we thankfully don't need to worry about having to drop down, since just by holding right you eventually change layer onto the platform automatically. It doesn't really matter how fast you get through this thing since you're completely safe while inside, and your progression is indicated by the bubbles on the next platform, which after collecting, it's easy to keep counting the movement of the pistons to know when it's safe to drop down, and then jump out. Where now after walking past the goddess, brings us to the final challenge of the level. Another sponge winch like at the beginning, except thankfully, this one has far fewer obstacles, none of which are in the middle. So to minimize the amount of necessary input as much as possible, I found that by approaching the sponge very slowly while holding R1, and then very slowly walking off the edge once you have it, you're able to pretty consistently travel straight down the middle for most of the ride. It only stops working once you reach these two wheels. So this is where we decided to use the music again, where once collecting the first prize bubble, we turn it on. We then wait until the bass intro of the song finishes to tap slightly right on the analog stick, and then slightly left shortly after that. Where a few moments later, you can let go to meet the king and queen.
Oh my god!
Which pretty much finishes the level. All that's left is to pull the lever, move against the right wall, and drop down to the left to land on the horse, where after waiting for long enough, then lets you jump to the right and touch the scoreboard. This was honestly the most surprising completion for me across the entire challenge, because after making it past that one hard part, I managed to do the entire rest of the level first try, which was just amazing. It really made all of the practice beforehand feel worth it, with how pretty much every strategy just worked exactly how it was supposed to. And so now, this finally brings us to the final level of the game. How hard will it be? Will it be worse than the last two levels? Let's see. Well, the collector really only has 3 main parts to it, and is overall just not that long of a level. So I kind of knew going into it that it wasn't going to be any more challenging than most of the previous levels. But that's not to say that it still didn't take several attempts, with some of its own clutch moments. So after getting out of the carriage and using the elevator, we enter the first phase of the fight, which has a total of 4 brains. This is by far the easiest of the 3 phases because of how the machine's attack pattern is the same every time, meaning we can just wait against the left wall until hearing the alarm sound to get the first hit, move over to the right wall until getting the second hit, then stay on the right side to avoid the electricity and get the third, to then finally move back over to defeat it, all without dying once. The second phase is where things start to get difficult though, with how much the boss moves around, and the enemies that it spawns. There are 6 brains here, and the first one is given to us for free, where the first two enemies then spawn. Thankfully, they're not the ones with two arms, so I try to kill them immediately. After this, I move over to the left to try and get the second, third, and then fourth brain before the next enemies spawn. It can just be pretty hard to do with how there's nothing that can tell you your exact position, but doing it makes the rest of the phase a lot easier, and it thankfully worked when I tried it. We then kill the enemies by listening to the movement of their arms, wait through the next punching phase, and then kill the final two enemies in the exact same way once they spawn. This then starts the endless punching cycle, where we have to try and get the final two brains that are inside of each hand. I really didn't have much of a strategy for this part, besides trying to listen for when each fist hit the ground by using the sound effects, and just hoping I was able to make it to each brain. Which only works because of how the hands are far enough apart that you can tell which is which by the volume of their sounds. So I did end up getting crushed several times, but I was eventually able to make it into the third and final phase of the fight. The idea here is that you try and stand on the right side of the machine, so that as it's opening you can get both the inner brains on that side, to then do the same thing on the left as it's moving. I ended up failing both of these things. Then afterwards you can get a bounce on the outer brain to make it into the middle, which I was able to do, where the only remaining one should be on the outer left, which is easy to get, ignoring the sponge block entirely since dealing with it just makes things harder. So since I messed up the inner brains, I ended up getting the right ones on the next cycle, where I then got the outer left one after even more cycles and a few more deaths, since again, there aren't really any good ways to know how close you are to the boss, meaning I was just kind of guessing for everything. So at this point, the only brains that I still had to get were just the two inner left ones, but I didn't actually know that, and I was already down to my last 2 lives. Thankfully though, it's completely safe in front of the checkpoint, so I could just wait there while I thought about everything. I figured that I must have already gotten all of the outer brains, so it was only the inner ones that I wasn't sure about, and I could actually hear how close the boss was to me by how loud it was. So I ended up waiting until I knew it was there, and went for the inner right brains, which cost me a death, but it made me certain that it had to be the left ones that were still there. So on my last life, I waited again until the boss came over and did the same thing, except this time on the left side, where with help from a bit of luck, my thinking actually paid off, and I was able to defeat the final phase of the fight just before getting a game over after only an hour of trying. Man, if only we could get some extra lives up in here. Actually, I could send out a second sack person to do it for me. Oh my god, oh my god, oh my god, oh my god. It wasn't completely over though, with how I ended up getting stuck on the sponge block when trying to exit the arena. But once I realized what was happening, it was fine. And so after all of that effort, with the hours upon hours of attempts, practice, problem solving, and pure effort that it took to make it through each and every challenge that was thrown at us across 8 worlds and 26 levels, we finally chase the Collector down and complete LittleBigPlanet while blindfolded. Sort of. Although we did complete the entire story mode without looking, while doing 1 level at a time, an incredible achievement in itself, it's hard to say that this challenge has truly been beaten until an entire blindfolded playthrough of the game from start to finish is completed. And even though we've shown today that it is possible, we've also shown how immensely difficult it would be, since after spending a total of 92 hours across 19 streams just getting to this point, I can't imagine the amount of extra practice and luck that would be needed to do it all again within a single session. It's something that I would love to see happen, but not something I'm willing to do myself, as just getting to this point was already extremely difficult to find the motivation for, and it isn't even the reason why I wanted to explore this challenge in the first place anyway. I think what makes this challenge so interesting is how it forces us to pay such close attention to all of the things about the game that we don't really think about otherwise. Like the exact behavior of every sound effect and how they interact with the worlds, and the specific structure and layouts of each level, to then find the best possible strategy with the little information that we have from all of that. I couldn't believe how many little things about every level that I hadn't actually committed to memory, when I thought that I already knew them inside and out completely, and also how much I learnt by listening to the game's sound design closely. It makes me appreciate the thought that must have gone into all of it. I've never really liked challenges that put the restraint on the person's abilities rather than the character's, like having to play with only one hand for example, because it doesn't change anything about the game itself, and is entirely dependent on how much skill the player happens to have, which varies completely from person to person. Whereas a challenge where it's Sackboy who isn't able to do something, like use his grab, the focus is now centered around what's physically and technically possible within the bounds of the game, which does not vary from person to person, which I think is much more interesting. However, I think what makes the Blindfolded challenge so much more interesting and fun is that it's a mix of both of these things, where even though a majority of it is just having the skill to make it through each level, the limited information that's possible to come from the game is what determines how skilled and lucky someone would need to be. But in conclusion, thank you to everyone who watched my streams while I was attempting to do this. I definitely wouldn't have been able to finish without the help and encouragement. Also, thanks to MX for randomly giving me the motivation to start doing this. And of course, thank you to Night Carries, who, as well as creating this challenge, was the biggest help in taking down some of these insanely difficult obstacles thanks to your creativity and skill. It could be fun to try and complete the minigames one day too. I don't plan on doing this anytime soon though. And again, I apologize for not having a proper face cam, but I hope that the explanation and development for each strategy is the more interesting and valuable thing anyway. You can find a playlist of all 19 livestreams that it took to complete this in the description. Oh yeah, I was also supposed to rank the levels from easiest to hardest, so here's that. Skulldozer, Introduction, The Meerkat Kingdom, First Steps, Get a Grip, The Frozen Tundra, Swinging Safari, Lowrider, Subway, Great Magician's Palace, Boomtown, Elephant Temple, Burning Forest, Serpent Shrine, The Collector, The Wedding Reception, The Darkness, Skate to Victory, The Terrible Oni's Volcano, The Mines, The Collector's Lair, The Dancer's Court, Endurance Dojo, The Construction Site, Sensei's Lost Castle, and The Bunker. Thanks for watching.